The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above Margaret Walsh's head, a sound like electrical insects trapped in glass. 11 p.m. at Mercy General. The cardiac unit was a cathedral of beeping monitors and soft breathing, the kind of place where time moved differently, minutes stretched like hours, hours compressed to nothing. She pushed the medication cart down the corridor, her movements economical, precise, each step measured like someone who'd learned long ago that wasted motion could cost lives. 3 months. That's how long she'd been pushing this cart through these hallways. The antiseptic smell mixed with burnt coffee from the break room, a combination that hadn't changed in 2 years. She'd chosen this hospital deliberately, small enough that nobody asked questions, large enough that anonymity was possible. San Diego was far from Oregon, far from her son Kieran's worried phone calls, far from the VA clinic where they all seemed to recognize something in her eyes that she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Mercy General was safe. Mercy General was quiet. Mercy General was supposed to be the place she could breathe. Margaret paused at the medication lock, her hands entering the code with fingers that had performed battlefield amputations in 120-degree heat now reduced to distributing diuretics and beta blockers. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady. That was the problem. Steady hands made people notice you. Steady hands asked questions. She caught her reflection in the glass medication cabinet, grey streaking dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, face weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age. 53 years old and looking 62. The limp was worse on morning shifts, so she'd requested nights. The scar on her left forearm, too straight, too surgical to be accidental, a piece of shrapnel from Ramadi 2004 that had missed her radial artery by millimeters. She wore long sleeves even in San Diego heat. The break room was empty. Margaret moved to her locker, the metal door opening with a crack like a gunshot in the silence. Inside, hanging on a hook, were her combat boots. Worn. Weathered. The laces were frayed, and the leather held the memory of sand that no amount of cleaning could remove. She touched them briefly, her fingers brushing the rough surface like a talisman before each shift. A ritual. A prayer to someone she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. That's the third time tonight. Margaret turned. Yuki, the resident from the night shift, stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. Younger. Brighter. The way Margaret used to be before the explosions, before Ramadi, before everything that was supposed to matter stopped mattering. Making sure they're still there, Margaret said quietly. Yuki smiled and handed her one of the cups. The coffee was terrible, burnt, too hot, the way hospital coffee always was. Margaret accepted it like a benediction. The cardiac unit was full tonight. Room for 02 had a post-MI patient still throwing irregular rhythms. Room for 05 was a valve replacement recovery, stable but cautious. Room for 08 had been empty all evening, the bed stripped and waiting like an open mouth. Then the ambulance radio crackled to life. Mercy General, this is County Transport, ETA for minutes, incoming trauma alert. Captain James Morrison, Navy, 34, training accident with blunt force thoracic trauma. Positive chest wall crepitus, decreased breath sounds left side, BP 120/85, heart rate 108, oxygen saturation 94% on high flow. Patient is conscious, alert, oriented. Establishing large bore for access, running normal saline wide open. Margaret's hand stilled on the medication cart. Her lungs did something strange, compressed and then released, like muscle memory reacting before conscious thought could catch up. Captain James Morrison. She'd heard that name exactly once before, 8 years ago, from a Navy chaplain in a hospital in San Diego where he was signing adoption papers for a dark-eyed boy pulled from rubble in Ramadi in 2004. An 8-year-old boy with a scar on his shoulder from flying glass. An 8-year-old boy whose family had died in the building where Margaret's unit had been called to extract wounded Marines. The chaplain had said the boy would have a good life now. The chaplain had said the boy's name was James and he would be loved. Margaret had never allowed herself to follow up, to check, to know. Some doors were meant to stay closed. Room for 08, the charge nurse called out. Chest trauma. Let's get fluids running, crash cart standing by. Margaret moved. The motion was automatic, trained through thousands of hours until it became reflex. But her mind was elsewhere, was in Ramadi, was 18 years in the past, where a young Master Chief Petty Officer pulled a boy from rubble and handed him to a chaplain and tried to forget that she'd felt his heartbeat, small and terrified, against her chest. The ambulance doors burst open and the gurney rolled through like a ship cutting through dark water. Captain James Morrison was conscious, yes. Conscious and watching the paramedics with the kind of calm that only came from someone trained to stay present under pressure. Military bearing. Officer posture. The way he gripped the side rail told Margaret everything. He was in pain, significant pain, but he would not show it, would not admit it, would not let anyone see it. He was exactly like the boy had not been. The boy had been terrified. The boy had cried. The boy had been 8 years old and covered in dust from a collapsed wall in Jolan district. Get him into 408, the ED physician ordered. I want a chest CT immediately, EKG on the monitor, draw labs, CBC, CMP, troponin, lactate. Someone page Dr. Henrik in cardiac surgery. Margaret moved into room 408 behind the gurney, her hands already reaching for the equipment, for extension tubing, three-way stopcock, pressure bag for the fluids. The scar tissue in her forearm pulled tight, muscle memory and current moment colliding like aircraft on a collision course. The captain's eyes found hers for exactly 1 second as they transferred him from the ambulance gurney to the hospital bed. Brown eyes. Dark. The same shape as the boy's eyes, 18 years ago, looking up from the rubble with dust in his hair and terror in his expression. But the captain's eye saw a grey-haired nurse in her 50s. An older woman. Someone who'd worked night shifts for 3 months and moved with the careful precision of someone managing arthritis and fatigue. The captain's eyes did not see the legend who'd walked into a collapsed building under fire. The captain's eyes did not see the senior chief petty officer who'd earned a Navy Cross in Ramadi. Margaret's hands did not tremble as she established the 4. Her voice did not shake as she asked his medical history. Her breathing remained steady and measured and utterly controlled as she placed the EKG electrodes across his chest and watched the monitor paint his heartbeat in green traces. Any allergies? She asked, keeping her voice neutral, inflectionless. Negative, the captain said. No allergies. His breathing was labored. Not critical, not yet, but labored in a way that told Margaret his lungs were not happy. The positive chest wall crepitus the paramedics had noted, crackling under the skin from air leaking into the subcutaneous tissue, meant something was wrong with his pleural space. The decreased breath sounds on the left meant his left lung was compromised. The training accident had given him a pneumothorax. Simple. Treatable. Except that his breathing was worsening, which meant the pneumothorax was not stable. Which meant it was becoming a tension pneumothorax. His O2 sat is dropping, Yuki called out, eyes on the monitor. 92. 88. 85. Get more oxygen on him, the ED physician said, already reaching for his phone. Page Dr. Henrik. Tell him we have a potential tension pneumothorax. The captain's chest was beginning to become rigid. Margaret watched his intercostal muscles working harder, fighting for air, the kind of work that would exhaust him if it continued. His shoulders were rising with each breath. His jaw was clenching. The tremor wasn't fear, or it was effort. Tremendous effort, expended in silence. I'm calling up to see where Henrik is, the ED doc said, phone pressed to his ear. He's in the lounge. He's on call. The phone buzzed once. Twice. 3 times. The captain's oxygen saturation continued to fall. 84. 81. 79. Margaret watched the monitor like she was watching something die. The trace of his heartbeat was racing now, accelerating as his body began to comprehend that it was not receiving adequate oxygen. The panic was starting, just at the edges, just barely visible in the way his hands had begun to grip the bedsheet. Let me try calling again, the ED physician said. The phone went to voicemail. He's sleeping, the operator said when they called the house line. Dr. Henrik said if he's called for just a pneumothorax, to let him sleep. He said pneumothorax is stable. Call him if it becomes something else. The silence in the room was the sound of a man drowning on dry land. Margaret's hands were already moving. Her brain had shut off the civilian nurse part of her, the part that deferred to physicians, the part that waited for orders, the part that had been trained by 2 years in Mercy General's neutered corridors to accept boundaries. Something else had taken over. Something that remembered remedy. Something that remembered how to make decisions at the speed of life and death. She was already reaching for the equipment she would need. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was that Captain James Morrison, still conscious, still fighting for air, looked at her with those dark brown eyes, the eyes of the boy she'd saved in 2004, the eyes she'd never allowed herself to follow up on, and he seemed to recognize something in her expression that made him nod. Just once. Just barely. A nod that said, "I trust you." She didn't know that he was 8 years old when she'd pulled him from the rubble. She didn't know that he'd grown up to become an officer. She didn't know that he'd spent 18 years wondering who the woman was who'd held him in the hospital room, who'd made him feel safe, who'd saved his life. But he would. Soon. And that would change everything. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway at exactly that moment, his white coat still crisp from the laundry, his expression moving from annoyance to something sharper as he watched Margaret prepare the needle decompression kit. He did not move to help. He simply watched, his eyes narrowing, calculating something behind his perfectly groomed face. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Dr. Sterling's office smelled like expensive cologne and paper, the kind of sterile environment where decisions were made that affected other people's lives. Margaret sat in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, her hands folded in her lap, a scrub still carrying the faint antiseptic smell of the night shift. 3 documents lay before him, each typed on official hospital letterhead, each a fabrication. Margaret. He didn't call her Nurse Walsh. Just Margaret. The kind of casual dismissal that made subordinates feel small. "We need to have a conversation about your fit here at Mercy General." She said nothing. Waiting. He adjusted his reading glasses, gold-rimmed, the kind that cost 3 weeks of her salary. The cardiac unit has raised concerns. 3 separate incidents. He pushed the papers toward her like evidence in a courtroom. Lack of collaboration with attending physicians. Failure to follow contemporary protocols. And frankly, a cultural incompatibility that's affecting team morale. Margaret's jaw tightened. Barely perceptible. She'd read those papers before he'd even printed them. She knew every word was calculated. A resident had warned her yesterday, hands shaking, he's documenting everything. 3 separate complaints, all within the last month. I think he's building something. Building what? Margaret had asked. A case, the resident had whispered. I practice evidence-based medicine, doctor. Always have. Her voice came out steady. Professional. Deferential in the way that made older men underestimate you. I'm happy to discuss any specific patient care decisions. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a smile crossing his face like a predator recognizing weakness. That's the problem, isn't it? You think you practice at the same level as our physicians. You think your experience compensates for lack of formal training. He tapped the papers. The unit doesn't work that way anymore. We've moved on from the old model. And frankly, Mercy General has moved on from people who can't adapt. The words landed like fists. Margaret had trained combat medics under fire in Ramadi. She'd kept a 19-year-old Marine's intestines from spilling onto the hood of a Humvee while incoming rounds punched through the metal above her head. She'd stabilized 18 patients in a field tent with a suture kit and her hands and prayer. But none of that mattered here. None of that existed here. She took one measured breath. A single tear escaped, not from sadness, but from the effort of not speaking the truth that would burn this entire place down. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. I've practiced evidence-based medicine longer than you've been alive, Doctor. Sterling's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind his eyes. Rage. The kind that men like him carried when they realized their psychological weapons weren't working. He straightened the papers on his desk. Take the rest of the week to think about whether you want to continue at Mercy General. I'll be documenting this conversation. Margaret stood. She said nothing else. The silence in the room became a presence of its own, pressing against them both like humidity before a thunderstorm. 2 days later, the cafeteria during lunch rush was packed with nurses, residents, attending physicians, dietary staff, and a handful of patients in wheelchairs. Margaret was halfway through her sandwich, turkey on wheat, nothing remarkable, when Dr. Sterling appeared at her table like a stage entrance in a play nobody had asked for. She saw it coming a half-second before it happened. The way his arm moved. The angle of his body. 30 years of combat awareness meant her nervous system recognized the threat before her conscious mind had time to process it. She could have moved. Shifted the tray. Stood up. Something. She didn't. His hand connected with a ceramic plate. Soup sprayed across the white tile floor in an arc of red that looked like a crime scene. The sandwich went spinning. Coffee exploded like shrapnel, the cup shattering against the metal chair leg with the sharp crack of a gunshot. The room went dead silent. Even the machines in the kitchen stopped their mechanical humming, as if the entire hospital had drawn a collective breath and forgotten how to exhale. Margaret knelt to gather the debris. Her movements were slow, methodical, controlled, the same careful precision she'd used picking shrapnel from a child's scalp while explosions shook the walls around them. Broken ceramic. Soaked napkins. A piece of sandwich that had slid 6 feet across the floor. Dr. Chen, Sterling's resident, laughed first. A sharp, nervous sound. Then he raised his voice so the entire cafeteria could hear. $20 says the old woman quits within the week. Any takers? Other residents started laughing. Margaret heard the specific cruelty of young men who'd never had their certainties challenged by consequences. Some of the nurses looked away. That was worse somehow, the erasure, the refusal to even witness what was happening. Sterling stood over her, his Italian loafers gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Pick that up, sweetheart. Isn't that what you people do? Clean up messes. Margaret's hands didn't shake as she collected the final pieces of broken cup. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She didn't make eye contact. She simply gathered the destruction of his own making, inch by inch, until there was nothing left but empty air and the memory of what had been there. Then she stood. One tear tracked down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she met his eyes with the kind of devastating calm that only comes from having already survived things that would shatter most people into irreparable fragments. I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor. Much worse. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This silence had texture. This silence had weight. This silence was the sound of something fundamental shifting in the room, a moment where the power dynamic flickered like a failing light bulb, and for just an instant, Dr. Sterling realized he was standing in front of someone whose composure was not submission, but something far more dangerous. His smile faltered. That was all. A half-second of uncertainty before he turned and walked away, Dr. Chen following like a remora fish trailing a shark. Margaret stood alone in the center of the cafeteria, surrounded by people who had been willing to watch her humiliation and were now unwilling to meet her eyes in the aftermath. She gathered her things. What remained of her lunch went into the trash. The other nurses at nearby tables suddenly became very interested in their own food. That afternoon, Sterling threw her patient charts across the nurses' station in front of 3 residents and a surgical intern. Sloppy. Incomplete. Unacceptable. His voice carried the particular venom of a man whose psychological intimidation tactics weren't working as designed. Redo every single one. And I want them perfect this time. Margaret collected the scattered papers without responding. The other nurses wouldn't meet her eyes. The surgical intern suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. In the medication room, alone, she began rewriting each chart with meticulous precision, not the casual neatness of a hospital nurse, but the exacting documentation format of combat medical reports. Every vital sign. Every intervention. Every timeline. Not just clinical accuracy, but the kind of obsessive detail that would survive legal scrutiny and military investigations. Her handwriting was different when she was angry. Tighter. More controlled. The kind of precise lettering that came from writing incident reports under fire, documentation that had to be perfect because lives and courts-martial depended on it. By evening shift, Margaret sat in her car in the Mercy General parking lot, her hands finally trembling on the steering wheel. The VA hospital was visible from here, 3 miles across San Diego, with its own parking lot and its own waiting rooms filled with people who understood what it meant to carry wars inside your body long after you'd left the battlefield. She couldn't drive there yet. She wasn't ready to admit that the job that was supposed to be her sanctuary had become another battlefield. She wasn't ready to ask for help. She wasn't ready to surrender the fiction that she could simply be a civilian, that she could move through a normal hospital and save normal lives without the ghosts of Ramadi following her like shadows that the sun couldn't burn away. In room 408, 3 floors above the parking lot, Captain James Morrison was sleeping peacefully, unaware that he'd been saved 18 years ago by the same hands that had just gathered his medical charts with military precision. The hospital was settling into its night rhythm, fewer voices, more machines, the particular silence that only falls between shifts when one world is ending and another is about to begin. At 9 p.m., an ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, lights flashing red and blue against the hospital's concrete walls. A patient. A training accident. Internal bleeding. A deteriorating pneumothorax that the ER doctors would miss because they weren't looking for the subtle signs of a collapsed lung in progress, the way the chest wall moves asymmetrically, the thin whistle of air escaping from places it shouldn't escape. By the time Margaret clocked in for night shift, she would be assigned to room 408. By 11 p.m., she would page a surgeon who didn't believe her. By 1:02 a.m., the patient's oxygen saturation would start its fatal descent. And at 2 a.m., Dr. Sterling's orders would stand between Margaret and the only choice that mattered: let a man die following protocol, or save him and end everything. The alarm silenced with a soft press of Margaret's thumb against the button. Room 408 went quiet except for Morrison's gasping, a sound like a drowning man who'd already given up on air. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back toward the hallway. Her eyes stayed on the captain's face, on the rigid expansion of his right chest, the paradoxical collapse of his left. Tension pneumothorax. 18 years since Ramadi, and her hands remembered this diagnosis before her mind caught up. She moved to close the door. The latch clicked with finality, a sound like a breech block seating in a rifle chamber. Inside these 4 walls, there was only her and Morrison and the brutal clarity of what came next. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice pitched low and even. "Can you hear me?" His eyes found hers. Wide. Animal. The eyes of a man whose body was betraying him in real time. "I'm going to help you." Margaret was already moving toward the crash cart, her step silent on the tile. "But you need to understand what's happening. Your right lung has collapsed. Air is building in your chest cavity, pressing on your heart. You're going into cardiac tamponade." "What?" His breath came in wheezes, his words fragments. "What do I?" "You do nothing. I do this." She opened the cart with movements that belonged to someone else, someone in desert fatigues under an unforgiving sun, someone who'd learned that hesitation was a luxury only the living could afford. "What's your first name, Captain?" "James." "James, I'm Margaret. I'm a nurse here at Mercy General." She found the 14-gauge angiocath, the needle gleaming under the overhead light like a piece of silver pulled from water. "I'm going to perform a needle decompression. It's going to hurt. It's going to feel like I'm stabbing you, because I am. But when I do, your lung will re-expand. You'll breathe again. You understand?" He nodded. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles flexed like iron bands beneath his skin. She prepped his chest with a sterile pad, her left hand finding the landmarks of his ribs with the kind of certainty that came from having done this in conditions far worse than a San Diego hospital room. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The spot where a needle's width made the difference between life and the kind of death that looked peaceful until the monitors told you otherwise. Her fingers pressed against his ribs, counting down, positioning, knowing. "Breathe in," she said. "Hold it." She didn't warn him again. She didn't whisper reassurances. She drove the catheter through his skin, through the intercostal muscle, through the pleural space with the kind of precision that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to save. The needle slid past the rib, past the membrane, into the pressurized pocket of air that was killing him. The hiss came like a burst valve on an industrial engine. Air escaped. Not a little. A flood. The sound of pressure equalizing, of a system desperately trying to return to balance after being shattered. Morrison gasped, a real breath this time, deep and genuine, not the suffocated gasping of a man drowning in his own chest cavity. Color crept back into his face like someone turning up a dimmer switch. His oxygen saturation numbers climbed on the monitor. 72. 78. 84. Margaret taped the catheter in place with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this procedure on a sand-covered landing zone while rounds snapped overhead. She'd never made a mistake then. She wouldn't make one now. "You're going to feel better," she said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. But this is temporary. The catheter buys us time. What we need is a chest tube and a surgeon who will actually show up. But between now and then, you need someone monitoring your breathing. Every 15 minutes, I'm going to listen to your lungs. I'm going to watch your chest move. I'm going to make sure that catheter stays patent and that you don't go back into arrest." "How long?" Morrison asked. His voice was stronger now, the panic receding into something more manageable. "As long as it takes." She pulled the vinyl chair from the corner of the room and positioned it where she could see both his face and the monitor simultaneously. She sat down and didn't move. The night stretched ahead like a runway with no end marker, but Margaret had learned long ago that the length of a night didn't matter. What mattered was the breathing. What mattered was the pulse. At 3 a.m, Dr. Sterling's night supervisor made rounds. Margaret heard his footsteps in the hallway, the shuffle of charts, the soft murmur of his voice as he documented the census in the unit. When he paused at room 408, Margaret didn't look up. She kept her hand on Morrison's wrist, counting his pulse, tracking the steady rhythm of a man whose heart was no longer being compressed by a pneumothorax. Through the window's small square of reinforced glass, she saw the supervisor's eyes widen slightly. Saw him note something on his report. Saw him move on down the hallway. At 5 a.m, Morrison drifted into sleep. Real sleep, not the unconsciousness of shock. His breathing deepened, his shoulders relaxed, and Margaret remained exactly where she was. Her hand never left his pulse point. Her eyes never left his chest. She'd held watch like this before, in a field hospital tent in Fallujah in 2006, over a 19-year-old Marine from Kentucky whose femoral artery had been severed and whose life hung on her ability to keep him conscious and calm for the 14 minutes it took the surgeon to reach him. He'd lived. Transferred out 2 weeks later with both legs, though the left one would never quite forgive him for the blast that nearly took it. She whispered to Morrison what she'd whispered to that Marine, what she'd whispered to a dozen others whose names she still carried like shrapnel in her chest: "I've got you." Again. The room felt smaller at 6 a.m. The San Diego dawn pressed gray and indifferent against the window, and Margaret had been awake for 22 hours. She'd stopped counting heartbeats somewhere around hour 4. Now she simply existed in the space between Morrison's breaths, in the rhythm of his chest, in the knowledge that the moment she moved, the moment she looked away, was the moment something could go wrong. That was when she heard the footsteps in the hallway. Faster than the supervisor's. Purposeful. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who'd already made a decision about something. Dr. Sterling appeared at the window of room 408 at 6:07 a.m. Margaret didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply existed in the chair beside Morrison's bed, her hand on the captain's pulse, her eyes on his monitor, and the knowledge in her bones of exactly what Sterling was seeing: a nurse who'd violated every protocol he'd written, who'd performed a procedure without authorization, who'd stayed in a patient's room for 8 hours without relief, who'd done the one thing he couldn't tolerate, saved a life in a way that made him irrelevant. He stood there for 30 seconds. Margaret counted them by Morrison's heartbeats. She felt Sterling stare like a physical pressure, like weight pressing down on the back of her neck. And then he was gone. His footsteps receded down the hallway toward his office, and Margaret heard the soft closing of a door. She returned her attention to Morrison's breathing. The captain slept on, unaware that his life had just become the focal point of a conflict that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with pride. At 6:15 a.m., Dr. Sterling made his first phone call. Then his second. Then his third. His office door remained closed, but Margaret could hear the murmur of his voice through the walls, angry, controlled, the tone of a man activating networks, calling in favors, preparing a counter-offensive against an enemy he'd vastly underestimated. By 6:45 a.m., he was printing pages from her personnel file. She could hear the printer whirring from down the hallway, the mechanical rhythm of a man documenting his case against her. He circled the Seattle clinic on her references with a pen that moved like a predator marking territory. His smile, when she caught a glimpse of it through the glass walls of his office, was the smile of someone who'd just found the leverage he needed. He reached for his phone with the casual certainty of a man about to make a call that would change everything. Margaret didn't move. She didn't flinch. She sat in her chair in room 408, her hand on a Navy captain's pulse, and she waited for the night to finally end, knowing that what came next wouldn't be rest or relief or recognition. It would be reckoning. The day shift nurse found her at 7 in the morning, still sitting in the chair beside Captain Morrison's bed, her scrubs damp with sweat that had dried and cooled against her skin over the past 8 hours. The monitor above Morrison's head beeped its steady rhythm, a sound that had become her metronome, her anchor, the only evidence that her hands had done something right in a world determined to prove her wrong. "You're supposed to be off at 6, the day nurse said, not unkindly, but with the careful distance of someone who had already sensed the storm coming. "Your shift ended hours ago." Margaret's voice came out hoarse, sandpapered by the long night. He needed monitoring. Continuous observation. "I stayed." The day nurse checked Morrison's chart, her eyes tracking across the lines of documentation in Margaret's precise handwriting. The needle notation. The O2 progression. The 8-hour vigil recorded in clinical terms that somehow failed to capture what had actually happened in this room while the rest of the hospital slept. The nurse's eyes went wide. Not shocked, Margaret had seen enough expressions to know the difference. This was recognition. This was understanding that what was written here, what was documented in this chart, violated every boundary of what a nurse without a physician's license was permitted to do. "That's beyond your scope," the day nurse whispered. That's what saved his life," Margaret finished quietly. She stood, her joints protesting after 8 hours of stillness, and walked past the younger woman without waiting for a response. She didn't have the energy for argument or explanation. She had learned long ago that speaking more than necessary only gave people time to find reasons to doubt you. By 8 o'clock, Dr. Sterling had made his first call to a board member. Then a second. Then a third. His voice on the phone, Margaret would learn this later from the whispers that rippled through the nursing staff like current through water, had been steady, almost clinical in its precision, dangerously unqualified, practicing medicine without a license, a direct threat to patient safety. He made each phrase land like a hammer strike, each one designed to make the person on the other end of the line nod in agreement before they'd even heard the full picture. By 9 o'clock, Sterling had begun making calls to her references. The Seattle clinic. The one she'd listed on her application. The one where she'd supposedly worked for 18 months before taking the night shift position at Mercy General. The clinic administrator who answered his call confirmed what Sterling already suspected: no record of Margaret Walsh. No employment file. No references to verify. The position had never existed. It was a ghost job, a cover story, the kind of careful lie that someone creates when they need to explain 2 years of their life without telling the truth about where they'd actually been or what they'd actually been doing. The silence on the other end of Sterling's phone line when he heard those words was the sound of an opportunity crystallizing. This wasn't just about a nurse who'd overstepped her scope. This was about a nurse with falsified employment records. A nurse who'd lied on her application. A nurse who could be erased completely, not just from this hospital but from any hospital in San Diego County, if he played this correctly. By 10 o'clock, Sterling had retained an outside risk management consultant, someone who specialized in documentation, in building airtight cases against healthcare workers who posed liability risks. The consultant was methodical, efficient, the kind of professional who had destroyed dozens of careers by simply recording what actually happened and letting the paper trail speak for itself. Sterling had learned, over the years, that the most effective weapon wasn't your authority, it was documentation. Let the facts do the work. By noon, hospital security appeared at the nurse's station with a cardboard box. Just a cardboard box, the kind used for moving, the kind that held the detritus of a life interrupted. The security guard was apologetic, which somehow made it worse. "Ms. Walsh, we need you to collect your belongings and report to HR." Margaret didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She simply walked to her locker, opened it, and began placing items into the box with the same methodical precision she'd used to monitor Morrison's breathing through the night. Her spare scrubs, folded into precise thirds. The stethoscope she'd purchased with her first paycheck from Mercy General. A water bottle with a motivational quote she'd never believed in. And at the bottom, she placed the combat boots, worn leather, the soles scuffed from years of wear, the laces tied in the military fashion she'd never quite been able to break, even after 2 years of trying to be someone else. The termination letter was waiting in a sealed envelope on her HR file. Professional. Documented. Airtight. Practicing beyond the scope of a registered nurse license, the letter stated. Falsification of employment records during the hiring process. 2 violations that, taken together, made her not just fired but unemployable. Not just at Mercy General but at any hospital in California that ran a thorough background check. The letter was dated 12:11 p.m. By 1 o'clock, she was escorted from the building by the same guard who'd handed her the box. She passed Morrison's room on the way out. He was awake, breathing easily, the oxygen saturation on his monitor holding steady at 96%. His eyes tracked her as she moved past the doorway, recognition flickering across his face, not of who she actually was, but of the fact that someone important to his survival was leaving, and he had no idea why. "Nurse, what's your name?" he called out, his voice still rough from the breathing tube. "You saved my life. The day nurse said you were here all night. I need to thank." She paused in the doorway. She didn't turn around. If she'd turned around, if she'd met his eyes, if she'd allowed him even a moment of connection, something inside her that had held together through the entire night would have fractured completely. Tears were already streaming down her face, hot and silent, the kind of crying that made no sound because she'd learned long ago that sound brought attention, and attention was dangerous. "Just doing my job, Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Then she walked down the corridor without looking back, carrying the cardboard box that contained everything she'd kept of her civilian life at Mercy General. By 3 o'clock, she was sitting in the waiting room of the VA hospital across town, surrounded by veterans she recognized from her field hospital days, some of them patients she'd treated while their bodies were broken, their minds still mostly intact. None of them recognized her. She was just an older woman in scrubs with a cardboard box beside her, waiting for her number to be called. The intake form for PTSD counseling trembled slightly in her hands. Not from fear. She'd learned to recognize the difference long ago. This tremor was something else, it was the physical manifestation of restraint, the body's way of containing something that wanted desperately to escape. She filled in the blanks with clinical precision, the same precision she'd used to document Morrison's vitals through the night: name, age, years of service, combat locations, tours, Ramadi, 2004 to 2006. That was the line that did it. That was the moment her hands actually shook enough to make her pen skip across the paper. An older veteran sitting nearby, a man whose left arm ended at the wrist, whose eyes had the particular hollowness of someone who'd seen things that fundamentally rewired how they understood the world, leaned over slightly. First time, he asked quietly. Margaret didn't look at him. Second time, she said. First time I'm actually showing up. That's brave, the veteran said. Then, after a moment, or desperate. Sometimes they're the same thing. The combat boots sat beside her chair on the linoleum floor, scuffed and salt-stained, their laces tied in the exact knot she'd learned to tie in 2002 when the world still made sense and heroism was something you could quantify in clear missions and measurable outcomes. They looked out of place in a waiting room full of civilians in regular shoes, out of place in San Diego where no one wore military footwear unless they were still active duty. She'd kept them because she couldn't throw them away. They were the last physical evidence of the person she'd been before she'd tried to become someone else, and now that person had been fired from a hospital for saving a life. The waiting room hummed with the quiet desperation of people finally admitting they needed help. A woman across the room was crying silently into her hands. A man near the window stared at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare that Margaret recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly glow that made people look like ghosts of themselves. Margaret's number was called at 3:45. She stood, picked up the cardboard box, left the combat boots on the chair for a moment, just for a moment, before reaching back down to retrieve them. She couldn't leave them behind. Some things, once carried, became part of you. Some weights couldn't be put down, no matter how much they dragged at your arms. The intake counselor was a man in his 60s with grey at his temples and eyes that had seen 1,000 stories like this one. He didn't introduce himself with pleasantries. He just looked at her filled-out form and began asking questions in a steady, methodical way that suggested he'd done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 times more. Combat-related PTSD, he asked, already knowing the answer from her service dates. Yes, Margaret said. How long has it been since you sought treatment? 2 years, Margaret said. Since I left the Navy. And why now? She looked at the cardboard box in her lap. At the combat boots beside her feet. At the clock on the wall that read 3:52, just hours after Morrison had started breathing on his own, hours after she'd been fired for saving his life, hours after choosing to finally stop running from the person she'd been. Because, she said slowly, I can't keep pretending that hiding from it is the same thing as healing from it. The counselor nodded like this made perfect sense. Like he'd been waiting for her to arrive at exactly this understanding. Like her lowest point, fired, alone, sitting in a VA waiting room with combat boots in her lap, was actually the point where something new could begin. Margaret stood in her apartment at 6:30 in the morning, cardboard box at her feet, hands moving mechanically through drawers that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. 3 months of night shifts folded into plastic bags. A coffee mug with faded print that said San Diego Harbor. A framed photo of Kieran at 16, gap-toothed and grinning, taken back when she still knew who she was. The eviction notice on the kitchen counter had a circled date in red, 14 days. Sterling's network had done its work fast. Every San Diego hospital, every clinic within 50 miles, blacklisted before she'd even left the parking lot. The knock came at 6:47. Not a knock, really. More like the sound of someone who'd driven 8 hours straight from Portland and had no patience for doors. Kieran stood in the hallway, 17 years old now, holding a wooden shadow box the size of a small coffin. His hands trembled as he thrust it toward her. Inside, under glass, the Navy Cross. 2 silver stars arranged like parentheses. 3 purple hearts in a diagonal line. Below them, a small bronze oak leaf cluster. Ribbon she hadn't looked at in 18 months. Medals pressed behind glass like butterflies pinned to felt. Mom. His voice cracked. They need to see these. Margaret couldn't speak. Couldn't even reach for the box. She stared at the medals like they belonged to someone she'd buried a long time ago, in a desert where the heat made mirages of people who weren't there. Kieran didn't wait for permission. He walked straight past her, shadow box held level as a newborn, and walked toward the door. "Where's Mercy General's administrative building?" By 7:15 a.m., they were standing outside a mahogany conference room on the 3rd floor. Through the glass walls, Margaret could see Dr. Sterling at the head of a long table, presenting slides to the hospital's board of directors. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. Enhanced credentialing protocols. Scope of practice violations. Risk mitigation strategies. The word sounded clean, scientific, absolutely deadly. Kieran didn't knock. He pushed the glass door open, walked straight to the table, and set the shadow box down in front of the board chair with the kind of deliberate precision that made every person in the room stop breathing. "That," came a voice from the doorway, "is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh." Captain James Morrison sat in a wheelchair, against direct medical orders, dressed in the dress blues he'd been saving for his retirement ceremony. His right lung was bandaged. His ribs were taped. His face was the color of old parchment. He looked at the board chair with the clarity of a man who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "3 Purple Hearts," Morrison said. "Not just medals. 3 times she was wounded in service. Ramadi, 2004 through 2006. She was 24 years old the first time she got shot." The hospital's head nurse, a woman named Chen with 30 years of tenure, reached for the shadow box with trembling hands. She opened the sealed envelope taped to the back, the one Margaret had filed under confidential restricted records when she'd started at Mercy General, the one she'd hoped no one would ever need to see. Her DD 214 discharge papers. The document that proved everything. Chen's voice was barely above a whisper. 22 years naval service. Combat medical specialist. Ramadi 2004 through 2006. She looked up at Sterling, then back at the papers. Her hand shook. This says she was decorated." The doors at the back of the conference room opened. A man in a Navy uniform stepped through, not in dress blues, but in the muted colors of operational dress, the kind worn by people who'd recently come from places where dress uniforms meant you were dead. His shoulders carried the weight of things that had no names. SEAL Team 3 insignia on his sleeve. His face was weathered the way faces get weathered from looking at things the human mind isn't supposed to process. "Navy Cross for Valor," the commander said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and inevitable. "Silver Star for extracting 12 wounded personnel under sustained fire from 3 directions. Personally credited with saving 47 lives." He paused. His eyes found Sterling and locked. One of those lives was an 8-year-old Iraqi civilian boy. That boy is now sitting in that wheelchair wearing Navy dress blues, commissioned as a captain, because Margaret Walsh pulled him out of rubble in Jolan district while rounds were impacting around her head. Sterling's face had gone the color of wet concrete. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from the water, gasping for air that wouldn't come. She pulled him out, the commander continued, then came back for the others. 12 extraction runs. 1 rotation. 47 lives documented. He set a folder on the table. Every name. Every rescue. Every confirmation. That's when the FBI agents walked in. 2 of them, moving with the slow confidence of people who knew exactly where everything was and how long they had to dismantle it. The older one, a woman with iron-gray hair, placed a second folder on the table. "We've been investigating billing fraud at Mercy General for 6 months, Dr. Sterling. Phantom consultations. Patients charged for services never rendered. $200,384 in fraudulent claims over the last 18 months. She let that number hang in the air like smoke. Your billing pattern increased exponentially after Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh was hired. Specifically, her presence in the cardiac unit seemed to trigger a remarkable spike in emergency consultations you charged for but never actually provided. Sterling's resident, Dr. Chen, not the head nurse, but the young doctor who'd made the bet about Margaret lasting a week, stood up from the corner where he'd been taking notes. "He told me to announce it," the resident said, his voice steady but hollow. "The bet? He told me exactly what to say. He also..." He swallowed. "He knocked her tray deliberately in the cafeteria. I watched him do it from the kitchen. And the night Captain Morrison came in, he called me and told me to make sure her note said she was being overdramatic about his condition. He said if anyone asked, I should testify that she panicked unnecessarily. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. Could suture a wound in it. Could hear the fluorescent lights humming like fluorescent lights always hum, that high-frequency whine that isn't quite sound. The board chair looked at Dr. Sterling the way you look at something that's been dead longer than you realized. You fired a decorated war hero for saving a patient's life. A patient you refused to treat adequately." Sterling stood up. His voice came out strangled. "She falsified her employment history. The Seattle clinic, those references don't exist. She lied to this institution. She was undercover," the SEAL commander said flatly. 22 years of service, 3/4 of that classified, and she didn't want recognition. She wanted to heal without being recognized. That's called integrity, doctor. You wouldn't recognize it if it had a pulse." The board chair made a gesture. One small movement of her hand. The same security guard who'd handed Margaret a termination box at noon yesterday walked into the conference room carrying an identical cardboard box. He placed it in front of Dr. Sterling with the precision of someone performing a ritual. "Set it down. Step back. Didn't speak. I believe you know the way out, sir," the board chair said. Sterling reached for the box and his hand shook, the first time any of them had seen him anything less than absolute. His voice came out thin. "This is a misunderstanding. I have connections. The medical board, the state licensing. The medical board has been notified," the FBI agent said. "Your license is under review for fraud and patient endangerment. We're also examining every patient outcome from the past 18 months. Every case where your billing records suggest you may have prioritized charges over care." She closed her folder. "You can leave now, or we can have this conversation somewhere considerably less comfortable." Sterling walked out of the conference room like a man moving through water. Past the nurses' station where 3 nurses wouldn't meet his eyes. Past the cafeteria where he'd knocked Margaret's tray to the floor while residents laughed. Past the bulletin board where his Employee of the Month photo was already being taken down by a maintenance worker. Security stayed 3 steps behind him until he reached the parking garage. 35 minutes later, Margaret's phone rang. She was still standing in her apartment, staring at the eviction notice, when the board chair's voice came through the speaker. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh? This is Dr. Reeves, board chair at Mercy General." A pause. "We would very much like you to come back." Margaret's hand started to shake. The first time she'd let herself shake since the call had come that Sterling was gone. The first time she'd let her composure crack because composure was a tool for survival, and if she was going to survive this, she needed to break something. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go back. They'll see, they'll know I'm broken." Kieran's voice, from the doorway where he'd never left. "Mom. They already know. They know because a captain in a wheelchair drove himself to the hospital against medical orders. Because the SEAL commander came from 3 states away. Because 47 people are alive because of you." He crossed the room and took her shaking hands in his. "They'll see what you've always been. They'll finally see what you are." 6 months later, Margaret Walsh walked through Mercy General's new veterans clinic, through doors that opened automatically like they'd been waiting for her. Part-time position. Flexible hours. Created specifically for someone with her credentials and her needs. Her scrubs were navy blue, the same color her uniform had been, and on her chest, a small pin shaped like a caduceus wrapped in anchors. No longer hiding. On her desk sat a pair of worn combat boots, the one she'd carried in her trunk for 2 years, the ones that smelled like diesel and sand and all the desert she'd walked through. Inside them, fresh flowers arranged by someone with knowledge of what roots need to grow. White lilies from Captain Morrison, who visited every month now, bringing other veterans, building a bridge between the military world and the civilian hospital that had almost destroyed the woman who saved his life. Dr. Sterling taught CPR at a community college 22 miles away, making minimum wage, teaching chest compressions to high school students while his medical license remained suspended pending a criminal trial that the prosecutor had told him would not go well. His network had dissolved the moment the FBI started asking questions. His connections had evaporated like water on hot asphalt. His reputation was a name people avoided speaking aloud. The news coverage had been direct: Mercy General settles fraud case, decorated nurse reinstated. When Margaret walked through the cafeteria on her first official day back, the nurses stood. Not applauded. Just stood. A quiet recognition of something they'd gotten terribly, completely wrong. She took one measured breath, felt one tear escape, not of pain this time, but of gratitude, and nodded with the quiet dignity of someone who'd carried heavier things than anyone in that room could imagine. In the veterans' clinic, she taught a young Marine with a traumatic amputation how to live in the body he had now. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm and certain. "I've been where you are," Margaret said, her voice dropping into the register that came from somewhere deep and true. The trembling stops. The nightmares fade. You'll find your way home. Captain Morrison brought his crew, other wounded warriors, other people looking for someone who understood what it meant to survive something that was supposed to kill you. Margaret taught them all the same way she'd taught Morrison, with absolute competence and absolute compassion. 6 weeks into her return, a young nurse approached her desk, pale and nervous. Margaret looked up from the chart she was reviewing and recognized the fear in the kid's eyes. The fear of not knowing if you're good enough. "I have to perform a needle decompression," the young nurse whispered. "Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. 14-gauge catheter. And I'm terrified." Margaret stood up and walked with her toward the bay. As they scrubbed in, Margaret's voice was steady. "Hesitation kills," Margaret said. "Trust your training. The needle doesn't care about your doubt. The patient doesn't care about your fear. Save the life in front of you. That's all any of us can do." The nurse's hand steadied. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. O2 SATs climbing from 67 to 89. The patient breathing steadily. The young nurse looked at Margaret with gratitude and confusion, gratitude for the guidance, confusion about why this quiet woman in scrubs knew exactly what to say in the moment it mattered most. Margaret smiled. "You'll figure it out," she said. "We always do." On her office wall, behind reinforced glass, hung her shadow box. The Navy Cross. The silver stars. The purple hearts. Below it, on a shelf with flowers that Morrison refreshed every month, sat those worn combat boots. The leather was cracked. The laces were frayed. The soles were worn through in places where 22 years of walking had worn the material thin. A small brass plaque was mounted below: Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, service above self. It was Kieran's voice, in the closing video he'd made for the hospital's website, that captured everything. "My mom taught me that courage isn't never being afraid. It's showing up afraid and doing it anyway." She served her country for 22 years. Then she served one more patient when everyone else walked away. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. And in that veterans' clinic, surrounded by the wounded she'd chosen to heal, Margaret Walsh finally planted roots in soil instead of sand. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.